Good afternoon, everyone. Well, not afternoon for everyone, but good day. Thank you very much for this time and the opportunity to present this work that Pierre and I have been working on. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Okay. The work that I'm presenting today with Pierre is part of a larger project that we've been working on for a number of years. Our firms and experts view the Phillips curve, evidence from individual and aggregate data from South Africa. Basically, we're beginning looking at the ERSA inflation expectation, more recently being given access to the individual data, which opens up a lot of opportunities, specifically when you have a look at the separate groups within this aggregate survey numbers. So to be able to look at the firm level data and the expert data, in other words, the financial analysts separately. So our motivation for this really is that inflation expectations have become, inflation expectations and central bank communication as these expectations. First of all, we need to be able to measure the expectations in an accurate way that is valid. And we also rely on hypothesized economic theories about how inflation expectations relate to other variables. And for example, one of these most important ones being the Phillips curve that we begin with in this paper. And so, yeah, I refer here to a quote by Ben Bernanke. He says, theoretical treats to neglect the fact that in practice, many measures of inflation, the measures exist. And he also then later says that expectations of businesses are particularly scarce. So we start by thinking about his quote and recognize that even a decade later, Janet Yellen admitted that this situation had changed little. We start by thinking a little bit about how they are measured. And so our first contribution is to focus on the data set from the BER survey, because there is increasing interest in focusing on the business sector as price setters. But we also, throughout the paper, look at the financial analysts' expectations as well, purely because this is where people start. And of course, we are able to look at the individual expectations and then to compare these, see how they differ. So this is very interesting. What makes this business sector survey in particular very interesting is that it really, when in the paper we compare it to other surveys globally, and it really is available in a number of ways. For one, the data is available for 19 years at a quarterly frequency, and this was done regularly over those 19 years, and this is actually pretty unique in itself. They also ask the respondents about 1 year, 2 year, and even more recently, the 5 year ahead forecasts. So at a number of forecast horizons, right? Beyond asking about the inflation expectations, they also ask the respondents about their views about a number of other macroeconomic variables, such as inflation, real GDP growth, the rand dollar exchange rate, and even wages. So this means that we have a number of other variables that you could conceivably think would be important when people are forming their inflation expectations. Importantly as well, we also have a broad set of microeconomic controls that are asked of the respondents. So this includes the size of the firm, that from which this inflation expectation is coming, the position of the person that answered the survey. So you can realize that the survey could vary quite a lot. So it is a useful thing to be able to see whether this is making any difference. And then an important control that's there is also the SIC code, so the Standard Industry Code. And this is useful because what we are still at this stage trying to do is to potentially link this data set to other data sets using the Standard Industry Code. So this would be a way to access other macroeconomic controls from other surveys. I'll speak about that a little bit later, towards the end, because this is something we haven't yet developed in a very strong way. So we are also able to compare this data set that we're focusing on, the business sector survey, with the financial analysts, as I said, and we can, in a general sense, compare it to the household level data that Pierre and I have worked with previously. The second contribution that we make, besides just learning more about the data set, is to ask ourselves how firms and analysts view this trade-off between inflation and real economic performance. We estimate a variety of inflation and wage growth Phillips curves. The reason we sort of focus on the wage growth is sometimes forget the fact that the Phillips curve originally was estimated in terms of wage growth. While this hasn't been, there is increasing interest in going back to this more recently, partly because inflation is sort of well anchored. We have a flattening of the Phillips curve, this kind of thing. So we're starting to look at whether this is also the case for wage growth. But also we expect, it's conceivable to think that across different industries, the sensitivity to cyclical behavior might be different when we look at wages versus inflation. And of course, our survey, very importantly, allows us to look at how different how inflation expectations are differing across industry. The reason we might think this is important is because besides being able to model the different behavior and understand this, it's useful from a behavioral point of view. The minute you want to use something, some information that you have from models and theory for policy purpose, is people's behavior, how their behavior differs, and what kind of variables might be driving this behavior. So, for example, that some sectors are conceivably more sensitive to changes in the exchange rates, or might be more sensitive to wage pressures. So again, we refer to a quote here by Janet Yellen, that the Phillips curve approach has usefully informed monetary policy making across the globe. So although there are lots of questions about the Phillips curve theoretically, and how the theory is playing out in terms of our ability to model, there's still, policymakers still rely a lot on the Phillips curve. So we'd like to think harder about this. In terms of the expectations data, just give a little bit more detail about the BER's survey data. We recognize that because of the richness of the data set, it offers a lot of opportunities for us in terms of analyzing how this behavior how the expectations are formed, but there do remain a few challenges which we acknowledge. For one, the way that the survey question is asked, there might be a risk of priming, in that the question gives the respondents the previous inflation numbers so historical inflation numbers, before asking them what they believe inflation will be going forward. The consequences of this is not clear yet. Pierre and I, in previous work in a separate paper, have also looked at the effect of this priming on household expectations, and there it does appear to have quite a significant effect. But these respondents, of course, better informed, so it is possible that it has a lesser effect over here. This is something, you know, that we can try and look into going forward. We don't believe it has a strong effect here. Another thing to mention is that this BER survey design, we need to ask the extent to which it's conducive to learning about these expectations formation, in that we can have a look at the format of the survey question here. They ask the respondents, what do you expect average headline inflation to be? Whereas when they're asking the other questions, they ask about year-end forecasts. So we just point these two things out. Quabion and others have also offered a survey paper quite recently about what's available in terms of business sector surveys, and he mentions a number of these potential shortcomings in terms of how different surveys ask respondents about inflation expectations. And really across all of these, the BR survey really does compare very well. So while acknowledging these, and you know, we intend to have a look into them, it's still a very strong survey set. I just want to mention here, just give you a little bit more detail about the contents of the survey. So in terms of you can see the business sector here on the left-hand side and the financial analysts. Of the business sector, the BER asks them the inflation expectations for the current year, the year ahead, 2 years ahead, and more recently 5 years ahead. And they ask similar questions in terms and the rand-dollar exchange rate. For the financial analysts, they ask a wider range of, well, a few more variables, right? At the bottom there you can see they ask them about capacity utilization, M3 growth, and the long-term government bond yields as well. But many of the variables do overlap, and so there is opportunity to compare their responses to that. I think Pierre will take over at this stage for a bit.
All right, I'll try to this time just share my screen and just hope it works. If not, we'll go back to Monique. She has the same presentation. So hopefully you can see. If not, you can holler, but it seems like it's working. As Monique mentioned, the part of the motivation stems from an earlier paper that we wrote, which she alluded to, with together with Stan Duplessis, which is forthcoming, I assume, next year in economic systems. And there we look at 5 surveys, household surveys, that were conducted by or the data were obtained from the BER, which is the same source for the data set we're using here. Now, the reason we have 5 of these samples is because I guess the funding we were able to obtain only allows us to purchase that much. And so we were conscious that we wanted to pick 5 episodes, 5 periods over a decade, which gives us an idea of more than one full cycle when it comes to inflation and real economic activity. So that explains the choice of the dates. If you're interested, that paper is available, and so you should be able to look at the details. Now, Monique also alluded to the pros and cons of surveys. In particular, household surveys have become much more prominent and popular these days. It's quite remarkable, the heterogeneity of how these surveys are conducted. You would think something as simple as asking what inflation is would elicit sort of similar questions, but there's actually quite a variety of questions. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to talk about inflation over a period of time as if it's clear what it is, Monique showed you the question that's posed in the financial analysts and business survey. It's comparable in the household survey. But here, just to give you a sense of what some of the data look like, and so I'm going to proceed in 3 steps. I'm going to give you some general stylized facts about the data, some background information and tests in advance of showing you some set of estimates of the Phillips curve, and there'll be selected estimates with other estimates available in the full paper if you are interested. In addition, incidentally, as I go along, we provide in this paper a survey of worldwide evidence on business or firm surveys. Those are comparatively rare, and like household surveys, they are quite heterogeneous. And I think Monique was correct when she says that if you look at the available data sets on surveys of firms and their views about future inflation and economic activity, the survey that we have in South Africa is quite remarkable. It really does stand out. It's a time series, and it contains a lot of socioeconomic information, some of which I'll allude to, but for the purposes here of focusing on the Phillips curve, I'll keep in the background, and I'll have a few remarks to say toward a little bit later on. So here, what I want to draw your attention to is in the first column, you have mean household inflation forecasts. These are 1 year ahead forecasts. As you'll see, the business forecasts are richer. The household forecast, that's all we have left. That's all we are given. What is clear is that household inflation expectations tend to be on average higher than business expectations. You can see that from the third column, similar with financial analysts. Now, the other thing that's distinguishing characteristic of household surveys versus the business and financial analyst survey is the fraction of, if you like, outliers, or the fraction of the population that say we don't know what inflation is, or it's 0%. Now, we don't quite have that data for businesses and financial analysts, but we have enough data to tell that if there are outliers, they're far less extreme than the ones for households. So in the third and fourth columns, in the brackets, you have the range of estimates. So for example, in October 2006, the mean inflation expectation 1 year ahead for businesses was almost 5%, but the range was 3.5 to 10%. And the terms in brackets are standard deviations, and those are clearly much smaller than they are for households. That's not surprising given the fraction of outliers that I've mentioned earlier. The standard errors, or the standard deviations, with one exception, or the last 2 exceptions, are comparable for financial analysts and businesses, but the last 2, and this is probably related to underlying economic conditions, there's much more variation, and you'll see an actual measure of this very shortly. So that gives you a sense of how household expectations compare with those of the businesses and the financial analysts, which is the focus of this paper. So just a few pictures to show you what the data look like. So you have the inflation target range. You have the dark line is, excuse me, the observed inflation rate. And then you have the inflation expectations. And here, just to keep things a little bit simple, you have the current year forecast. So what businesses and financial analysts think inflation will be in the current year on average, 1 year ahead, 2 years ahead, and then 5 years ahead. Now here, what I want to draw your attention to is first, you will notice that if you look at toward the end of the sample here, you can see that businesses, their expectations stay very much at the top of the band. And in a separate paper that Monique and others have, well, there's 2 versions of this paper. They're forthcoming in journals again next year. We use information from SARB documents, but also from news reports and views of newsmakers to suggest that In fact, the SARB was, if not aiming for the top of the band, was permissive enough about the band that it is consistent with this type of expectation. Now, toward the end of the sample, which ends at the end of 2018, you can see that what's the noticeable difference is that financial analysts, their expectations really around 2016, 2017, begin to trend down towards the midpoint of the target, which the SARB in the last year or so, perhaps less, has begun to emphasize. There are other differences, particularly around the financial crisis, the global financial crisis. You can see that expectations of businesses rise more quickly than those of financial analysts. The ones in financial analysts, at least some of them, especially the 5-year ahead expectations, are lag behind. The 5-year expectations react much more quickly. So this says something, and I'll show you later some results, something about the degree of anchoring of these expectations, which is also relevant when you're thinking about what the Phillips curve might look like. And then the last thing I want to draw your attention to is the volatility of both inflation observed and expected inflation. You can see that until the financial crisis, both observed and expected inflation at all horizons practically was considerably more volatile. Less so perhaps in the case of financial analysts, and less so on average, that there's a noticeable decline in the volatility. So there are clearly differences overall between business expectations and those of financial analysts. I guess in the companion literature, financial analysts might be viewed as professional forecasts. They're not quite the same as, say, the survey of professional forecasters, but they're more comparable to the kind of surveys that you might see in something like consensus economics. So here's a different view of the same data. This allows you to see the spread, if you like, the varieties of expectations. So in the dark areas here show the range of estimates for short-run expectation businesses. So CPI T2 is 2 years ahead. This is the maximum and the minimum. And then you have for financial analysts. So the FA stands for financial analysts. The remainder stands for the businesses overall. So clearly there's a difference in the range of estimates. But keep in mind that financial analysts are more alike in terms perhaps of their views of the future. They're perhaps trained in similar fashion. They observe information more generally at the macroeconomic level, whereas these expectations, they're much wider, reflect industry level issues, even the firm level issues that might influence their expectations, whether it's input prices, wages, etc. So it's not entirely surprising to find this type of result, but you notice that there is clearly a difference in the range. Now, one thing that's interesting is that the gap in the range at the low end is quite small. So there is sort of a broad, limited view about how low inflation can be, but there is a wider range of views about how high inflation can be, either in the current year, the year ahead, and so on. So again, showing you some sort of interesting differences between the businesses or the firms and financial analysts. Another way of looking at the same data is to plot the distribution. So again, you can see that the peak, this is for businesses, the bottom is for financial analysts. The peaks are quite similar. Broadly speaking, the shapes look quite similar, but when you look a bit more closely, you can see that the tails are different. And both at the left, on the left side, and on the right side of the distribution. So while broadly they're similar, there are clearly some differences. And there are also differences in the current year estimate. You can see how the peak for financial analysts is higher, relatively speaking, than the peak for business. Again, just confirming some of the other stylized facts that illustrate the similarities, broadly speaking, on average. But when you drill down into the data, there are clearly some potentially, we hope, interesting differences in expectations formation across businesses and between businesses and financial analysts. Now, finally, sort of a more, if you like, formal way of looking at how these expectations behave is to ask, what is the level of disagreement among expectations? Now, there are different ways of measuring this. This is one measure that I've used based on some work I've done previously, but it's not the only one. There isn't, I can't say a sort of a uniform consensus on how to measure disagreement. There's probably 2 or 3 different ways, and they generally are consistent with each other. So it's a measure, if you like, of the spread between an individual forecast and some measure of the mean or the median. It could be the mean or the median of the sample. It could also be something else, like you could use, for example, the SARB's inflation forecasts here as a measure of disagreement. So here I'm just going to stick with the amount, the data that we have. And the way this is measured is that the higher the number, the greater the disagreement. So the most obvious thing that you notice when you look at businesses and financial analysts is that, of course, disagreement varies over time. But you will notice, again, consistent with some of the earlier stylized facts I showed you, that disagreement tends to decline quite substantially in the last part of the sample, roughly speaking, post-global financial crisis. There's a sharp peak, not surprisingly, around the financial crisis, although the peak is partly a function of the horizon. So there's a larger, there's a smaller disagreement at sort of medium-term horizons than at long-term horizons. But notice when you look at the businesses, they react much more strongly to the impact of financial crisis, even at the longer-term horizon, which here it's 5 years, and in studies that are used in advanced economies, typically 10 years ahead is considered the long term, but for emerging markets, 5 years is considered long term enough. So we're happy to call that a long term expectation. Again, you can see the volatility at the beginning of inflation relative to what's observed and what's expected, and that's translated into considerably more volatile and more disagreement in the early phases of inflation targeting. But over time, other than the financial crisis, there is a general sort of a moderation in disagreement. And presumably one factor, we can't prove this here, of course, and that's not the focus of our paper, but we do talk about it in the paper that deals with the household expectations, is the role of inflation targeting, and now that how that has helped moderate inflation expectations and to some extent to anchor these inflation expectations. Now, one of the challenges you face, and I alluded to this before, is if you're going to talk about the anchoring on inflation expectations or the benchmark that you might want to use when you think about inflation expectations, what should you use? I made the argument earlier that based on news reports, the kind of communication that until, say, a year ago, the SARB would produce, it was not unreasonable to expect inflation to be at the top end of the band here. More recently, more closely at the midpoint of the band. And that was clear, that it was clear that from one of the earlier slides that financial analysts seem to have bought this. And you can see their inflation expectations trending towards the midpoint of the band, which is the dashed line here. Now, in comparable studies, if you have a midpoint of a band, it's quite reasonable to assume that the dashed line is another example of a goal that you might want to aim for, and therefore you look at your expectations or observed inflation relative to that objective. So there's no unique way of thinking about what the inflation target is, unless the authority is crystal clear that we aim for the midpoint of the band. So this picture here is to illustrate some potential alternative views of what that implicit inflation targeting number might look like, depending on the type of filter that you could use. So one filter could be a filter of the kind that Cristiano and Fitzgerald propose, where you extract the low frequency variation as opposed to the high frequency variation. Then, of course, there's the usual HP filters. There's a variety of HP filters. More recently, there's a Hamilton filter. So there's no shortage of filters. So this is just to illustrate that, although you won't see all the details here, that we did consider a variety of filters to see how sensitive our results are to the choice of that filter. And in addition here, just to illustrate, another source of inflation forecast. These are 1 year ahead forecasts. You can see these are the consensus forecasts. And you can see that the consensus forecasts, particularly at the end of the sample, the last few years of the sample, are very close to the mean of the current and 1 year ahead expectations that are drawn from the firms and financial analysts, from the firms rather. The mean of, the same mean for financial analysts is this line here, which hugs much more closely observed inflation. So whether that means says something about anchoring, or whether it captures the fact that financial analysts basically base their forecast on what they observed inflation was in, say, the last period, that's unclear from this picture. But the point is that there are alternative ways of thinking about what the objective might be, what the actual inflation target is, as opposed to what's announced. And this may impact, or this may have some impact on these results that we're going to show you in a moment. All right, just to, prior to focusing on the Phillips curve, I just wanted to give you a very quick overview of some of the other data. There's lots of other data. I'm only going to show you a couple of slides here. There are data on short-term and long-term interest rates. The short-term interest rate expectations are generated by the survey are based on the prime rate. It's not the same as the policy rate. The differences here are shown at the bottom. They more or less parallel each other, but sometimes the gaps are narrower and at other times they're wider. The long-term expectations on a particular type of long-term bond that you can see here. So these are the official designations of these long-term bonds that are used in the survey. And as Monique pointed out earlier, an actual copy of the survey is in the appendix of the paper if you are interested. Of course, if you go and collect your own long-term interest rate data, you usually have a blend of different bonds. So this is the line that you would obtain if you drew in data from the IMF, the International Financial Statistics. And this is the line that you would obtain if you took South African bond data for a range of maturities ranging from 10 to 30 years. So they're broadly comparable here, but the differences start to show around here. So you have some idea that the expectations that the respondents are asked to give an opinion about may not actually be the same as the long-term interest rate data that you would obtain if you were to collect the data from the IMF or construct your own based on a blend of long-term South African bond data. So just so you're aware of that. And then one other critical variable are wages. Now here, what I thought I'd show you is these are wage expectations. They're from the business or the firm side of the survey and the financial analysts. So at the top, you have the wage expectations of firms and financial analysts. You can see they broadly parallel each other. This is the current year. This is the 1 year ahead. Occasionally there are some gaps, but broadly speaking, they're quite close to each other. At the bottom, a slightly different picture. This is just for the firms in the survey. So again, the black line here are wage expectations, current year, 1 year ahead. And then that's the limit. We don't have long-term expectations for, say, wages. We do have for prices, but not for wages. And this gives you an idea, the gap gives you some idea of what the implicit expectations are for real wages. And you can see that for the most part, the expectations are for real wages to grow over time. There are occasions where that's not the case, notably during the global financial crisis. But at other times, the growth in real wages that's expected at the firm level is quite high. One of the things we cannot answer yet, because we don't have enough data, and maybe Monique will allude to this briefly at the end, is we can't identify, because of the way the data are constructed, we won't be able to determine very clearly the extent to which this is due to the effect of large unions having an impact on the rest of the economy. Certainly, one of the things we did was to read all the OECD annual reports on South Africa and the IMF Article 4 reports, and they frequently talk about how large institutions in South Africa, for example, Eskom, and their wage settlements spill over onto the rest of the economy. It would be nice to know the size of those spillover effects. At this stage, we can't give a clear answer to that question, I'm afraid. All right, so now let's move on to the Phillips curve. And here I'm going to show you two slides. And I won't show you all the evidence. There's more evidence in the paper. So here I thought, by way of background, I talk about this issue of inflation, the anchoring of inflation expectations, which I mentioned earlier. There's no unique definition of anchoring of inflation expectations. We all have sort of our own ideas of what that means, but basically it means how close expectations are to some target. And I've already discussed earlier the possibility that this IT number here, which is the target, is to some extent in the eye of the beholder. It could be 4.5%, or it could be the top of the band, 6%, or it could be something else. So here, I won't show you all the variations, but we consider these two numbers the purposes of some of these calculations here. And we assume, as I said earlier, that the 5-year head expectations are consistent with long-term expectations. So the kind of regression here that you see, and the results of which are reported in the table, is fairly common in the literature. It's often used by central banks to discuss the anchoring of expectations, and it shows in the equation, it asks whether the gap between long-term expectations and some inflation objective, to what extent is it being driven by the gap at the short end and the gap at the longer end, lagged one period. And the idea here is that this captures what we all know is the persistence not only of inflation, but of inflation expectations. Now, the focus here in the table below is going to be on this delta parameter, because as I sort of hinted at earlier, if there's a strong reaction to short-term shocks, there's less anchoring and vice versa. So at the top, the first set of results are for businesses. The bottom set of results are for financial analysts. And in addition, we asked, is there some asymmetry? I'll skip the asymmetry when I talk about the Phillips curve, but it was something that's in the back of our minds, which is, do respondents react differently to whether their expectations are above the inflation target or below the inflation target? And you saw some of the earlier pictures that the scope for values below the inflation target is much smaller than the scope of values above the inflation target. So broadly speaking, what you find is that there is some asymmetry. These are the standard errors, and you can see they're fairly small in relation to the size of the coefficients. These are the three horizons we look at: the current year, the 1 year ahead, the 2 year ahead. What you can see is that the size of the response here, this is one is not significant at the current year level. So they don't react too much for these shocks. So there's a little bit, some evidence of anchoring, but it declines the longer the horizon. You can see that it's 0.59 versus 0.25. Now, interestingly enough, turning to financial analysts, there's no, these are both statistically insignificant, well, except for this one at the current year, not at the 1 year ahead, and once again at the 2 year ahead. So there is some evidence of anchoring, but it's certainly far from being perfect. It is different between the businesses and financial analysts, which shouldn't be entirely surprising given some of the earlier pictures I showed you. There is, broadly speaking, when you compare the results here to the results down here, there's a little bit more evidence of asymmetry in the responses for businesses than for financial analysts. Again, this should not come as a big surprise because, as I said earlier, the range of values above the inflation target, there's more scope for expectations above the IT number than there is below. And so that's reflected up here. These are statistically significant, both at the current year, the 1 year ahead, the 2 year ahead. But moving on to financial analysts, you can see there's a mixture of results. There's some response when the error or the gap between these two numbers here is negative, but not at the current year, the 1 year ahead, and a 2 year ahead. So there's some evidence of an asymmetric response, but there's also some differences between businesses and financial analysts. So there's some evidence of anchoring, but it's variable over time and it's far from being perfect. How is it very different from advanced economies? I would say it's different in some advanced economies, but it is comparable to many advanced economies. Certainly, you would not find these results out of line if you look, say, at the Eurozone, for example. All right, so lastly, before I turn the slides back to Nicole for some final, to Monique for some final remarks about the wage data. Here, what I'm going to try to do is to summarize some of the Phillips curve estimates. I'm going to stick for the purposes of this presentation to the aggregate numbers, aggregate estimates, simply because it provides a way for me to compare what we found based on this micro level data compared to some of the more traditional Phillips curve studies which use aggregate data. And the Phillips curve here is a fairly standard one. It has a backward looking portion, that's the lag here in inflation. It has a forward looking element, that's the expectation of inflation. The I refers to the fact that these are individual level estimates, both we separate firms from the financial analysts. Now our measure of slack here, we're limited here because, in one sense, because the survey doesn't ask about the output gap, but it asks about real GDP growth in the current year and up to 2 years or a year ahead. And in most cases, real GDP growth estimates are not a bad proxy for slack. So that's what we're going to use. And then what I won't discuss are a variety of these alternative forecasts and individual firm level characteristics, such as the industry they're from, and the other forecasts that we have available to us. In other words, we're also conditioning on whether firms or financial analysts' forecasts of the performance of the rand, wage rates, etc. All the other, in the case of financial analysts, we even have forecasts for M3 growth and for capacity utilization. All those are included here, but I won't discuss these. Instead, what I thought I would do is I would just discuss these three box plots. The first thing to note, it's not obvious from this picture, but the first thing to note is that there are no outliers in these estimates. If there were outliers, you'd have little bubbles at the top and the bottom of these box plots. This gives you an indication of what these different elements of the box plots explain. I'm going to focus on three things. The mean estimate, which are these dark dots, the median estimate, and then the 95% confidence interval, excuse me, around the median estimate. So this is the slope of the Phillips curve. You can see there's quite a range. There is, however, the good news is that there's considerable overlap, if you look at the confidence intervals, in the slope of the estimates of the Phillips curve that we obtain, whether we look at businesses or firms, financial analysts. There's less variability in the estimates. Now, these estimates are generated by estimating a wide variety of these types of specifications using a different set of techniques, ranging from conventional OLS to GMM. We even provide some estimates that use a Markov switching model just to see how wide the range of estimates can be. So that's what's reflected in all these box plots here. Now, the thing, one thing you will notice is that the mean estimate of the slope is considerably higher than the median estimate. But there's not that much difference between the median estimate of the slope of the Phillips curve between businesses and financial analysts And there's hardly any difference in the mean versus the median estimate of the slope of the Phillips curve. So the next question that you might ask is, well, how do these estimates, you can see where they range from, compared to what you see in the literature, both for South Africa and more generally? And basically, they're not out of line with the kind of estimates that you might obtain if you looked at sort of aggregate studies based on conventional, more macro estimates of the Phillips curve. Where you see interesting differences, however, is in these last two box plots. So again, same thing. These are the mean and the median. You can see these are the confidence intervals. This is the forward-looking part of the Phillips curve, how forward-looking expectations are, the backward-looking part. Now here, what is striking is that there is no overlap in the confidence intervals. So the forward-looking part plays a much bigger role in terms of the weight on these estimates for financial analysts than it does for businesses. The forward-looking part is actually, if you look at the confidence interval, it's pretty close to being statistically not different from zero, although we found the range of estimates, the mean estimates, to be considerably higher, but the median is pretty close to zero. It's much higher in the case of financial analysts. Both the mean and the median are quite close to each other. Now the backward-looking, the flip side of this is that the backward-looking part is much more prominent in the case of firms. And again, there's no overlap in the confidence intervals. Mean and medians are very similar, again, for financial analysts. There's quite a gap between the mean and the median estimates for businesses. But you can see how large they are. They're statistically below 1, even at the top edge of the band here, but they're very high. They're anywhere between 0.85 to just over 0.9, considerably smaller for financial analysts. The only interesting thing is that the range of estimates is slightly bigger for financial analysts than it is the backward-looking part than it is for the firms. So that says something about what drives some financial analysts to when they're thinking about forecasting inflation. Now, what I don't show here are two things which are discussed in the paper. One is the Phillips curve estimates based on wages. There's a table in the paper, and I thought it's hard to sort of summarize here. So, but basically, the wage estimates parallel those based on the sort of more, at least in the last few decades, traditional way of estimating Phillips curves. One thing that's interesting about the estimates of the wage-based Phillips curve is that it allows us to talk more concretely about some of these socioeconomic characteristics. And there are clearly differences across industries and what drive wages, not just wage expectations, but how certain industries impact wage determination. Other than that, you get a picture that's comparable to this. You cannot construct a box plot like this for wages because we have less data. We're just constrained in the amount of data that we have. And that's both a challenge for us, but it's also an opportunity for future research. And I'll turn it back to Monique if she's ready to talk about the last parts of the paper. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Let me just share this again. Sorry. Are you seeing the correct thing?
Yes, looking good.
Okay, thank you very much. All right, I think I want to start by just referring to those box plots again before I speak about this last bit of data that we are trying to include in this study. I think some of the things that Pierre has been showing us, some of the stylized facts there, are the kind of things that we've been speaking about anecdotally and looking at when we compared even the aggregate data, the kind of differences that we believe exist between these different sets of inflation expectations. But what I want to perhaps emphasize is the implications of these differences. So for Pierre and I, it's very important to go through the exercise of understanding this data well, and seeing that it reflects the kind of things that we do sort of anecdotally believe to be true. But from an implication point of view, I want to highlight sort of two things. First of all, when we're modeling or speaking about inflation expectations, we would often traditionally have fallen back onto using the data that's easily available and at a high frequency, and that would have been professional forecasters or financial analysts. And in South Africa, what we also tend to do with the BERS survey is to use the aggregates of these different groups, and that is to use the financial analysts plus the business sector plus the other one that we haven't mentioned, being the trade unions. And I suppose what I want to point out is that there's a danger in using an average when you have this kind of difference. And is also in danger in using just the financial analysts, which are a relatively small group and potentially don't represent the price setters, as well as potentially the business sector does. And so there has been increasing interest globally in these business sector surveys. Taking one step further from this then, what you would have noticed from those box plots, as well as the degree of variance, the heterogeneity that exists also across this business sector. And so this is where I want to link to now, in that there's information in that heterogeneity that we would like to try and understand better. Again, if you want to use this kind of data in order to model better, as well as to inform policy about the way that people behave, it's important to understand, what caused this behavior. And so this is why Pierre has spoken about, our efforts to link it to these other variables. What we've also been hoping to do is to link this data set to outside sources of data, which I mentioned earlier. One of the most important being sort of the labor data that we mentioned, as well as potentially supply and use tables, where we might be able to get information, for example, about trade. So some sectors of the economy, and this is where I'm referring to the heterogeneity within these business sectors. It is very conceivable that it may be that some sectors are more exposed to trade-related differences. So specifically, changes in the rand or other pressures from abroad. So hang on, I am now, surprised by there we go. This is what I'm looking for. So the cost of some of the options that we have is labor data. First, there were a number of data sets that we could consider. The natural place to start would be the quarterly labor force survey. This because this is sort of the official data usually referred to, and another data set this quarterly labor force survey would be from Stats SA, and also the PALMS data. This comes from UCT's Data First. They use the raw data from the quarterly labor force survey, but they offer adjustments, such as because of the fact that they recognize that the quarterly labor force survey has potential problems in that when they ask people about their inflation expectation, their labor questions, if they ask them questions about their income, sometimes they will report within a range, and sometimes they get these zero responses. And when they're doing the inequality data, they find that this might be, there's reason to believe that this is distorting the data. So PALMS has tried to cope with some of these differences. However, this micro data is very useful for the labor economists, but it is complex to work with, and there are a lot of sort of dangers in this data. And what we sort of recognized after spending some time trying to understand how we could link this to our data set is that we would have to aggregate back up to industry level, because remember, the way that we're trying to connect the two surveys is via the standard industry codes. And so we would go through all of that trouble and expose ourselves to some of the risks that are natural from this kind of survey data without potentially this being necessary. So our alternative would be to use the QES, the quarterly employment statistics, and the supply and use tables. And what is different about these is that they ask these directly of the firms. This is the audited financial statements. So the reason the labor economists would tend not to use this is because they lose all the micro data, and potentially a large part of the population, right? But if our need is to link to explain how businesses are behaving, then this data potentially gets around the problems of the micro data, but still gives us actually strongly audited data. So while it's omitting part of this, of the working age population, we don't see this as a major problem. So this is where we would tend to go in order to get more information about labor numbers. I think I have spoken about a large part of these problems here already. What I will just emphasize here again is at the last point that this QES is collected from VAT registered firms. So it has more accurate reporting. What it also does, what I must also point out is that it's only excludes the agricultural sector. So we would need to recognize this, but all the other sectors are included. Another limitation of this data set is that it's only available from Q3 2009. So that would obviously also be a limitation. So we acknowledge that. Oh, another difference between the QES and the quarterly labor force survey is that an individual can appear more than once in this data set. So they ask the question from the point of view, from the firm's point of view. So if a person is employed in more than one firm, they would be represented more than once. So you do have to just recognize this little difference between the data sets. Note, so we, at the end of, our conclusion from looking at this different data is that it's probably still best to look at the quarterly employment statistics in order to have a look at the differences across the industries in terms of the exposure to trade-related pressures. We would look at the supply and use tables and the input-output tables. We had a look at what Stats SA could offer from this point of view first. And first of all, it's not available in sort of a time series fashion, but there is a private company, Quantec, that recognized that this kind of data is useful and they meet the demand. And the reason they can meet it when Stats SA cannot is that Stats SA is sort of bound by law not to provide data that is not fact. So they can't interpolate and do these kind of things. Whereas Quantec doesn't have this limitation. So their data set is in fact very well respected and would be a point where we can sort of access this kind of trade data. So this is the kind of the data that we would like to use moving forward to start to untangle the heterogeneity and give more explanation for what's happening within that heterogeneity. And that is where I'm going to leave it at this stage. This is the progress that we've made.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much, Monique and Pierre. We really appreciate all that research. And there is one question that has come up from a colleague, I'd imagine, at the University of Stellenbosch, although so either for you or Pierre to answer. So Guangling says, it seems the expected inflation from both business and FAs are quite accurate, except for the period of 2003 to 2005. He was wondering if there is a particular reason for that.
As Monique was presenting, I just went back to look. According to, I don't have a definitive answer, but if you look at Article 4 reports of that period, they mention three things that are affecting economic activity and inflation. One is the HIV AIDS crisis. The need, they keep doing that all throughout the last 20 years, but they seem to underscore the importance of the lagging structural reforms that are having an economic impact. And then there's quite a lot of apparently volatility in real GDP growth at the time. So those are at least three of this spilled over to financial analysts and firms. That's a different topic altogether.
Okay, and great. And then he also asks, he says, for the results of anchoring expected inflation, I guess both delta and gamma play a critical role. Not sure if there are certain ways to obtain the optimal values for these two parameters to improve the results. Perhaps if you could just comment on that.
Well, I don't have an answer except that the specification, as I said, is one that's often used really as a description of anchoring, but there are many different ways of thinking about anchoring, and there's more than one test. The expression I used in the slide is one that central banks like to use, but it's not the only one. So it's a kind of anchoring, but it's not the only kind of anchoring. I don't know if Monique has something else to add.
Not something specific to the model, except to agree that I think that there needs to be careful thought as to what we mean by anchoring. Just sort of anecdotally, it's often interesting to me that when I listen to even an academic research papers which sort of suggested that financial analysts and others were poorly anchored when they were forming expectations at the top of the band, which is interesting, communicating that they wish to move to the center of the band. A prominent economist, private sector economist, said to me at the time that they're sort of reneging on an implicit agreement as to where it should be, and that they're changing this. So it appeared to me that there was really pretty good anchoring. It just wasn't at the center of there was quite good coordination, if you want to put it in that sense. So anchoring is really something that we do need to think about, how we are measuring this very carefully. So yeah, that's all I want to add.
And the only thing I'd add, and I think Nicola wants to ask a question, is what the table doesn't show, and I don't have the results in front of me, is that we spent a bit of time to see whether the degree of anchoring based on this specification changes over time, because the data might suggest that there's more anchoring in the last, say, 5 years of data than in the first decade or so of the inflation targeting regime. And generally speaking, the answer is yes, that those coefficients, the short-term deviations from the target, the delta coefficient, have less impact over time on long-term expectations.
Yeah, actually, you just answered my question, because I was wondering that if there is a big change in period, because it's a very different period. But the second question was about the Phillips curve. If I understand correctly, you estimate the Phillips curve with different series for the expected inflation, isn't it?
That's right. So what I showed you was one variable that captures expected inflation. but we tried a variety of these. So we tried individual expectations, a blend of them. We even estimated a factor model to blend all these expectations just to see how these coefficients vary. So it does reflect those variations, yes.
I will try to understand what is the meaning of the coefficient then, because you have the actual inflation function of expected inflation and now you change the expected inflation series, but then what does it tell me? You're not evaluating what is the determining expected inflation, is what is determining inflation, and therefore what is the, are you searching for, the perfect measure of expected inflation, or the most, or therefore just to understand, and also why then you do trade union expected inflation? In some sense, is more linked to this wage output relation.
So if it's okay with Monique, I'll start.
Go ahead.
So our objective was not to try to find the optimal value for expected inflation, but to see how sensitive our estimates of the slope of the Phillips curve are to different ways of thinking about expected inflation. Because typically you go to a paper that estimates a Phillips curve, more often than not, they'll have an indicator of the 1 year ahead expected inflation rate, because that's what's most commonly available. But here we have a richer set of expectations, and it's conceivable that current inflation is not just linked to the past inflation record, but a variety of horizons in the future. So we have 1 to up to 5 years. So that's what's reflected in those box plots. It's just simply the richness of the estimates of the slope of the Phillips curve, not an attempt to get some optimal value.
Perhaps what I can add in terms of, why we haven't tried to use the trade unions, sort of 2 comments on that. First of all, that data set is much smaller, and we certainly wouldn't have as much confidence about the data set. But beyond that, my experience just looking at the data set originally is that I remember years ago having a look at the correlation between the business sector and the trade unions. And at the time, the correlation was 0.98. So what the trade unions do in practice in terms of negotiating may not be the same as what they report in those inflation surveys. I also think that if we were to only look at the trade unions, we're potentially only looking at a more limited number of sectors, right? Whereas a lot of what's happening in the wage pressures would be picked up in the business sector anyway. And we are also then getting the pressure across different sectors of the economy. If we were able to get a better way of quantifying which sectors are more exposed to the trade unions, then of course there might be an interesting way to link this to the survey of the trade unions. But at this stage, I honestly have much more confidence in the business sector survey than I do. And this is also why I don't like the use of the aggregates of these, because when the BR survey is used in aggregate, what you're doing is you're weighting that business sector survey that has, over 300 data points per quarter, the same weight as you are the trade unions, which really, in my view, is just losing information.
Great, thank you.
Great, thank you.
Very quickly, I noticed there was another question.
Yes.
Just very about the volatility and the role of changing food prices and energy prices, the component in the price index. I don't have an answer to that, but conceivably it has a role, and I've made a note that's something that we should think about. So thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. Yes, that was the last question that we see, and I think in the interest of time, it's probably a good idea to also wrap up. Today has been a wonderful day with a group of very distinguished researchers. So thank you all for all your wonderful ideas and for sharing them in a way that we can all understand and grapple with them, even if it is not our our unique area of focus. So thank you. It's really been wonderful. I really appreciate having your time with us.